and welcome back. We are going today to dive into a concept of what is known as a sprite sheet. And you might be wondering what a sprite sheet is. Now, sprite sheets are things that are very commonly used in applications such as video games or other applications wherein we might have a pixel art image such as this, and we might have multiple variations of that same image. But first, you're probably wondering what a sprite is. Well, a sprite is simply you can think of as an image. And we've done actually in a way with using our different layers to represent the different components of an image. And that's what a sprite is. Think about like if you ever played an old school 2D video game and you have a 2D character that's moving independently of the background. And that's because the character themselves is a sprite. And so here, when we look at this, this is a very simple image that I've created here that is representing of what could be, you say, like a ball, or maybe a marble. And this right here has a very static layout to it. It's not animated in any shape or form. But of course, we could make variations of it where we rotate the colors, maybe have this sparkle change, things like that. Now, what I want to do though is show how that looks in a sprite sheet. So I'm just going to, for now, just drag this by the layer panel and take it over to a sprite sheet form that I've kind of created. And you can see this is pretty large looking here because we might have multiple other variations. And while right now I don't have those other variations present, I do have enough here to show pretty much effectively one frame of this sprite sheet. Now you might be wondering what this frame is. Well, this is the thing that we're using to pack these in here. And so while we can look at some example sprite sheets, one of the things I do want us to stop and point out is when we start talking about the different frames we're looking at with a sprite sheet, it's best to kind of think about how things are in a grid pattern like this. So here I set up a 64 by 64 image, and these are all 8 by 8 grids where effectively you could put a 8 by 8 image into. So for example, if I were to put a 8 by 8 image in here, I'm just going to draw a quick little smile here. All right, so he is of course existing in this 8 by 8 grid space here, and maybe his next variation is doing the same thing, but maybe instead of being a big smile, now he's just kind of neutral faced. But then in the next frame, his next variation is going to take him right back to that same smile that we previously seen. And so this allows us to kind of see how movement gets mapped out when we start looking at things such as animation. So we have of course already done some animations that we've done with Adobe Photoshop, but now what the sprite sheets are is taking a predefined animation and putting it into something that another program can use. Because yes, while GIFs are really cool, they're really important how we can do things with, a lot of times when you're looking at another program or another application, they're not going to want that final animated image. Instead, they're going to want each of these individual poses. Now, how many poses are needed depends upon what you're actually creating. So for example here, just to have this face animate, I could actually probably have only just 2 of these frames. This frame could be something totally different. So instead of being a smile, for example, I could have this one be a frown because it is a different pose. Now sometimes you will of course have animations where those poses are the same because you're trying to repeat for movement purposes, so things are a lot more statically defined. But ultimately that's going to come down to some design decisions that come back to when you're working on the actual project you're working with. Now, one thing we do have to consider about is when we start working with sprite sheets is things such as the specification, the size of the sprite sheet we're working with. So for example, this image right here is a 64 by 64 image. No problem. But let's just scale things down and make it simple for moment here and go back to this example that I have with these images here set at 8 by 8. And with them being 8 by 8, you can see of course we have a very simple pattern here that we can move around with. And of course there's a total of 8 frames across. Now if I wanted to optimize this, because if I were to upload, let's just say just these 8 frames right here, all right, you can see that we have, of course, or 10 frames, excuse me, we have some wasted space, you could argue, things that aren't being used here. And so we could say, well, instead of making 10 frames here, we could set up our sprite sheet so it's just these 4 frames here. But what's if we did have other frames? What's if we had other things that we wanted to put into here? So for example, if I wanted to have 8 frames of movement. I could, of course, have a setup where it is these 8 frames here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if I drew 8 frames in this way, that would work as well. Or I could set up my sprite sheet in a way. I'm just going to adjust this view here a little bit. So that way we have 8 frames this way. So this is like a 4x2. So both of those are legitimate ways to set up your sprite sheet. You could also, of course, go vertical as well. How you set that up doesn't matter as much as making sure that you have some level of consistency. Because a lot of times when you're doing these sprite sheets, you want everything to be on the same size for the sprite that you're incorporating. Now you might have different sprites that have different base sizes. So for example, I could have an 8x8 here, and I could have another one that's 16x16. And that is fine, but typically here you notice each of these sprites are set up to be 8x8. So when we start talking about the conversation of optimization, we have to also think about what are we actually trying to optimize for. And when we have that conversation, that's going to come into what did we set up our image as. So for example, these are all 8x8 images that I'm roughly working with. But what's if I set this up and set up an 8x8? I'm just going to switch to a different color here just for a minute. Let's use red. What's if I had set these up instead of as an 8x8, I had set these images up as, let's say, a 7x9. So let's just count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 goes right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw the 7 down here. And 9, of course, is going to go one more. And so when I have a 7x9 image, this would be my first frame of reference. And then, of course, I would have to extend this out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Went too many there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And, of course, our 9 coming down. And, of course, we'd have to adjust it. Now, you can see our original image doesn't necessarily fit within this scope, and that's okay, because we would, of course, have to go and redraw within that boundary there. Now, that does affect how we ultimately design our sprite sheet for you. So for example, if I had a total of 7x9 images and maybe I had 10 of these, then I would have to make sure that when I have this set up that I draw this in such a way is going to have 10 bounding boxes here for me to work with. And that's what I want you to do today, is when we go ahead and start introducing this concept of sprite sheets here, I want you to go ahead and just draw some boxes here for the different sizes we're going to do. And it's going to be a pretty simple exercise. So let me just run you through one real quickly here. Let me just go ahead and say, let's do an 8x8 here. And let's say we're going to do it for, how about 8 frames of motion. All right. So we can do this multiple ways. We can do 8 pixels wide and just do all the way down. Or we could do, a 4x2 kind of grid. We can do 1x8. Let's do a 4x2 just because that's going to work out pretty nicely for us. So if we do 8x8, if I set up that, okay, well, how many pixels is that? Well, the easiest way to test that is with our good old handy calculator here. We know we have 8 pixels and we want to go 4 wide. Well, that means we need 32 pixels wide. So we're going to adjust this to 32, which means that if there's 2 rows of it, it's going to be 16. And Control 0 to zoom in. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush and I have it 1 pixel. And if I count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's the boundary right there for my line. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring this down. And so here's where the first bounding box would be. And if I, of course, switch that back real quick to red, just for what we have for counting purposes. If we were to say, where's the other bounding line? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's right here. So this, of course, gives us our second bounding line. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my brush to paint that in. And so now, of course, we have these 2 bounding lines. Now, of course, you might look at this and say, well, this is not exactly an 8x8 image. And that's correct. And if we look at these aren't necessarily exactly the same because we are technically filling in this one boundary line here. Like technically, this sprite would include this bottom line here. All right. And of course, if I were to extend this out all the way to the end, you'd have similar patterns erupting as you go through this. Because you'll notice like, oh, this is a little smaller than this square. Correct. Because again, remember this bounding here is technically also including, let me switch this back to red for a moment. This is technically right here part of this top image up here. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you start drawing these different bounding boxes. But it does help us give a nice visual representation for how sprite sheets are set up. Now as we move forward, we will actually find a way that we can do this in Photoshop, that we don't have to draw these lines, because again, these lines, it's kind of tedious to go through and count everything. There's actually tools set up in Photoshop for us to be able to do this. But for now, let's just go ahead, take a moment, and just analyze how can we divide up a image so we can have it ready for sprite sheets.